There is a village that no longer exists. Not because of war, not because of famine, not because the people simply left. It was removed, deliberately, surgically, erased from every map, every census, every official record. As if someone in power decided that this place and everyone in it simply should not have existed. No grave markers, no ruins, no name. Just silence and the faint outline of foundations swallowed by grass. You are about to hear a story that historians have quietly debated for over a century. A story that governments buried, that survivors were warned never to speak of. A story that only survives today in whispered accounts, fragmented letters, and just one photograph that should not exist. Stay with me, because what happened to this village in the 1800s is not just a mystery, it is a warning. Close your eyes for a moment and picture rural England, or perhaps Eastern Prussia, or the forgotten spine of the Carpathian Mountains. It doesn't matter exactly where yet, because this story could have happened in any number of places. And that, perhaps, is the most terrifying part. It is the early 1800s. The world is changing at a pace no generation before has ever experienced. Industrialization is swallowing the countryside whole. Cities are exploding with smoke and noise and desperation. Empires are expanding, redrawing borders with the cold confidence of men who have never visited the lands they are signing away. And in the middle of all this chaos, tucked between two hills beside a river that no longer bears its original name, there is a village. Let's call it by the name local historians have quietly assigned it in the few whispered academic papers that dare to address it. We'll call it Aldenmore. Population somewhere between 200 and 400 souls depending on the season. Farmers mostly, weavers, a blacksmith, a midwife who was also, depending on who you asked, something closer to a healer. There was a church, one of those stubborn old stone structures that predated the village itself by at least 3 centuries. There was a market square, cobbled and uneven. There was a schoolmaster who taught reading by candlelight because there was never enough of it during winter. It was, by every account that survives, ordinary. And that ordinariness is exactly what makes its disappearance so deeply, profoundly unsettling. Here is what we know with a degree of certainty. Between approximately 1812 and 1841, a settlement matching Aldenmore's description appears, briefly, inconsistently, in regional tax records, ecclesiastical registers, and a single land survey commissioned by a local magistrate whose own records were later destroyed in a fire that historians have described as suspiciously convenient. By the 1851 census, one of the most comprehensive population surveys ever undertaken in the British Isles, the village is simply gone. No entry, no cross-reference, no notation of a community disbanded or relocated. It is not listed among settlements abandoned due to enclosure acts, which were common in that period as wealthy landowners consolidated agricultural land at the brutal expense of rural communities. It is not listed at all. A cartographer named Edmund Reeves, working in 1857, reportedly discovered an anomaly while comparing older regional maps to current surveys. He wrote in a letter to a colleague that survived because it was accidentally bound into an unrelated collection of surveying correspondence that he had found, and I want you to hear this carefully, a complete absence where there ought to have been a presence. The roads lead to it. The field boundaries suggest it. The river bends as rivers bend around inhabited land, but the village itself is not there. It is as if the cartographer before me was instructed to look the other way. Reeves attempted to investigate further.
His subsequent letters on the topic do not survive. His career, notably, stalled sharply after 1857, and he died in relative obscurity in 1871. But records and letters are cold things. Let me give you something warmer. Let me give you Thomas. Thomas was 9 years old in the winter of 1836 when something began to change in Aldenmore. We know of Thomas because of a remarkable document, a handwritten memoir, incomplete and water-damaged, discovered in 1923 in the attic of a farmhouse roughly 40 miles from where the village is believed to have stood. The memoir was written decades after the events it describes. Thomas was an old man by then, tired, careful with his words in a way that suggests he had spent a lifetime being careful. But even through the caution, even through the faded ink and the missing pages, the fear comes through. Raw, vivid, real. He wrote of the winter of 1836 like this: "The strangers came first in twos, then in larger numbers. They did not speak to us. They walked the perimeter of the village with instruments I did not recognize as a child, but understand now to have been surveying tools. My father watched them from the window and told us not to go outside. He told it quietly, the way he said things when he didn't want Mother to hear how frightened he was." Thomas described the strangers as well-dressed, official, bearing documents with seals he could not read. They spoke to the village elder, a man named Gresham, described as white-haired and steady, and the conversation took place behind closed doors. When Gresham emerged, Thomas wrote, his face was the color of ash. He called a meeting of the village that evening, in the church with the doors shut and the candles lit, and the wind pressing against the old stone walls like something trying to get in. Thomas was not allowed inside, but he listened through a gap in the door, and what he heard, what he thought he heard, filtered through a child's understanding and an old man's memory, was this. He said we had a choice, but the way he said it, it didn't sound like a choice at all. A choice, in the 1800s, for a rural community with no legal resources, no political representation, no ability to appeal to courts that were designed by and for the wealthy. What did a choice actually mean? It meant comply or face something worse than compliance. The industrialization of Britain and continental Europe during this period was not a gentle process. It was a machine, and it ran on land, on cleared, consolidated, profitable land. The Enclosure Acts, a series of parliamentary decisions stretching across the 18th and 19th centuries, had already displaced hundreds of thousands of rural poor from land their families had farmed for generations. But enclosure, as brutal as it was documented. There were records, protests, parliamentary debates, angry pamphlets. Charles Dickens wrote about the human cost. Artists painted it. It left a paper trail a mile wide. What happened to Aldenmore left nothing. And that is the difference that keeps historians who know this story awake at night. Because erasure, true, deliberate, institutional erasure, requires something more than greed. It requires silence. And silence in the 1800s required power of a very specific and very frightening kind. Thomas's memoir ends its account of that evening with a single sentence that has been quoted in hushed tones by every researcher who has encountered it. He wrote, "By spring, we were told, we would not be here. And by spring, it was as if we never had been. What happened to the 200, perhaps 400 people of Aldenmore between that winter meeting in the candlelit church and the silence of the 1851 census? Where did they go? Who gave the order? And why? Why was so much effort taken not just to move them, but to unmake them? To scrub their existence from the record with a thoroughness that goes beyond administrative tidiness? The answer, when we find it in part 2, will be more disturbing than you expect. Because the people of Aldenmore didn't just disappear. They were used. If this story already has you gripped, hit subscribe, because what comes next is darker still. Drop a comment below. Do you think governments today are still capable of erasing communities from history? I want to know what you think.
A village. 200, perhaps 400 people. Farmers, weavers, children who played in a cobbled market square beside a river that no longer bears its name. Gone by spring. Erased by 1851. Unmade so completely that a cartographer who simply noticed the absence watched his career quietly collapse. In part 1, we met Thomas, a 9-year-old boy who pressed his ear to a church door in a winter night in 1836 and heard the last free conversation his community would ever have. We left him with a warning. Now we follow him into the dark. Thomas remembered the morning they left Aldenmore the way survivors of catastrophes always remember their worst moments, in fragments, in sensory details that made no logical sense to preserve, but lodged themselves in the mind anyway, immovable as stones. He remembered the smell of the air, cold still, but with that particular edge of early spring, soil turning somewhere beneath the frost, the smell of something beginning, which felt obscene given what was ending. He remembered his mother wrapping their clay dishes in cloth, moving with the mechanical efficiency of a woman who has decided that if she stops moving, she will fall apart entirely. He remembered his father standing in the doorway of their home for a long time, looking at nothing. And he remembered the men. Not the surveyors this time, different men, more of them, wearing the kind of coats that announced authority without requiring a single word. They stood at the edges of the village, at the road junctions, beside the church, near the well, watching. Not threatening exactly, just present, the way a locked door is present, the way a wall is present. Nobody ran, nobody resisted, nobody even raised their voice above a murmur, because Gresham had told them what the choice was, and the other option, the thing on the other side of refusal, was something the village elder had refused to describe in detail. He had only said, according to Thomas, that it was not preferable. In the language of the 1800s, spoken to powerless rural people by men with government seals, not preferable could mean almost anything. Debtor's prison, forced labor, the workhouse, that Victorian institution of industrialized humiliation where the poor were stripped of dignity and set to meaningless, punishing tasks as proof that poverty was a moral failure rather than a structural one. Or it could mean something quieter, something that left no record either. The village of Aldenmore packed what it could carry and walked away from everything else. Now, let us talk about how you erase a village, because this is not as simple as it sounds. Communities leave impressions on the landscape and the record that are extraordinarily difficult to fully remove. There are tax rolls, church baptism and burial registers, land deeds, letters, oral histories passed between generations like heirlooms. To erase Aldenmore, or whatever its true name was, required a coordinated effort across multiple institutional systems simultaneously. Historians who have studied this case, including a remarkable piece of investigative scholarship published in an obscure 1978 regional history journal by a researcher named Dr. Patricia Howell, who, incidentally, could not find a mainstream publisher for her work and eventually self-published a pamphlet that circulated quietly among local history societies, identified at least 4 distinct mechanisms of erasure at work. First, cartographic suppression.
Maps in the 1800s were not the democratic, publicly accessible things they are today. They were produced by official surveys, commissioned by government bodies and wealthy private interests. Removing or simply omitting a settlement from a new survey required only the cooperation or the coercion of the surveying body. One instruction to one man with a pen. That's all. Second, ecclesiastical record manipulation. Church registers were the closest thing to a civil record system that most rural communities possessed. Births, deaths, marriages, all recorded by the local vicar. The church register for the parish believed to contain Aldenmore shows a gap, a precise, clean gap between 1835 and 1840. The pages are not missing. They are blank. Howell noted that the blankness has the quality of deliberately leaving empty rather than accidental loss. The ink of surrounding pages had aged normally. The blank pages had not. Third, population reclassification. This one is perhaps the most chilling. When people were relocated, legally or otherwise, they could be recorded under new names, new parishes, new identities. Particularly if they were moved to institutions, workhouses, industrial labor schemes, early factory systems that were in practice closer to indentured servitude than free employment. These populations were recorded by institution, not by origin. Their previous home simply ceased to exist in the paperwork. Fourth, social silencing. This one requires no official machinery at all, just fear. Thomas himself wrote of being told as a child by his father that they were never to speak the name of their old home, never to write it, never to claim it. If asked where they were from, they were to name the nearest large town, a town many of them barely visited. Father said that the men with the coats could find us again, Thomas wrote. He said they had long memories and longer arms. He said Aldenmore was a word that could bring trouble the way a lit match brings fire. He obeyed his father for 30 years. It was only in old age, with most of the people who might punish him long dead, that he finally wrote it down. But here is what Dr. Howell's pamphlet circles around without quite landing on. The question that sits at the center of this mystery like a stone at the bottom of a well. Why? Enclosure was profitable. The displacement of rural communities to clear land for agricultural consolidation or industrial development had a logic, a brutal, dehumanizing logic, but a logic. You can follow the money in most cases of Victorian-era displacement. You can find the landowner who gained the acres, the industrialist who needed the location, the railway company that required the route. With Aldenmore, Howell found nothing of the kind. The land where the village stood was not subsequently farmed with unusual productivity. No railway was built across it. No factory rose on its foundations. No great estate expanded to swallow it. The land was, for all practical purposes, simply left. For decades after the village was cleared, the area sat largely unused. Local farmers from surrounding communities grazed sheep there occasionally. Children from nearby villages avoided it for reasons that were never made entirely explicit, but seem to have involved a general inherited unease, the kind of wariness that communities develop around places where something wrong has happened, even when the specific wrong has been forgotten. So, if it wasn't profit, what was it? Howell proposed 3 theories, each one more disturbing than the last. Theory 1. The village sat on land that was subject to a legal dispute so sensitive, involving parties so powerful, that its existence was an inconvenience to a settlement being conducted entirely outside public view. The people weren't the target, they were simply in the way, and erasing the village was cleaner than acknowledging the dispute. Theory 2. Something had happened in Aldenmore, or something had been discovered there that made its continued visible existence a liability to parties unknown. Howell was deliberately vague about what this something might have been, but she referenced in a footnote that reads almost like an afterthought the existence of a second document, not Thomas's memoir, something else. A letter, unsigned, written to an unnamed recipient, recovered from the same attic in 1923 alongside Thomas's memoir, but separated from it, stuffed behind a wall panel rather than stored with the other papers, as if someone had deliberately hidden it even from the hiding place. The letter describes something that the writer witnessed in Aldenmore in the months before the village was cleared, something that was being conducted in the old church, at night, by the men with the coats. Howell reproduced only one line from this letter in her pamphlet. She declined to reproduce the rest, noting that its contents were of a nature that requires further verification before responsible publication. The line she chose to share was this: "They were not surveying the land, they were surveying the people." Thomas's memoir, remember, is incomplete, water-damaged, pages missing, but the final legible passage, written in a shakier hand than the rest, as if age or emotion or both were affecting his grip on the pen, described something Thomas witnessed on the last night in Aldenmore. He had crept out of the house while his parents slept. He was 10 years old, curious and frightened in equal measure, the way 10-year-olds always are. He went to the church. The door was open. Inside, the men with the coats were gathered around something, a table. On the table were documents, many of them.
A village that was cleared. Not for profit, not for progress, not for any reason that leaves a clean, followable trail of greed and ambition. 6 villagers sitting quietly in a candlelit church, surrounded by strange instruments and men in official coats. A hidden letter describing people, not land, being surveyed. A smile from a man who knew something that could never be known. And a researcher named Dr. Patricia Howell, who got close enough to the truth that her work was removed from library shelves 30 years after she published it. We are about to go to the end of this story, and I want to warn you, the end is not a resolution. It is something far more unsettling than that. It is 1974. Patricia Howell is a 31-year-old researcher working at a regional university in the north of England, specializing in 19th century rural displacement. She is not looking for Aldenmore. Nobody ever looks for Aldenmore. Aldenmore finds you. Through a footnote in an obscure land survey, a passing reference in a colleague's unpublished notes, a name mentioned once and never again in a collection of Victorian correspondence. For Howell, it begins with a discrepancy. She is cross-referencing population data from the 1841 and 1851 censuses, routine academic work, the kind that fills years and rarely produces anything dramatic, when she notices that a cluster of surrounding villages in one particular county show an unusual spike in new residents between 1836 and 1842. Not unusual for the era in isolation. Rural migration was constant during industrialization. People moved toward work, toward cities, toward anywhere that wasn't slowly dying. But these people hadn't moved toward anything. They had moved laterally, village to village, across a radius of roughly 40 miles, and they had moved all at once, dozens of families arriving in a compressed window of time with no recorded origin point. No origin point in any surviving record, that is. Howell spent 3 months pulling at that thread before she found Thomas's memoir. Another 4 months before she found the hidden letter behind the wall panel, which she discovered only because the farmhouse was being renovated and a builder, not knowing what he had found, showed it to a local history society, who passed it to Howell almost by accident. She spent a year with both documents, and then she wrote her pamphlet, 41 pages, self-published, distributed to local history societies and a handful of regional libraries, because no academic journal or mainstream publisher would touch it. The reasons given were always the same: insufficient evidence, speculative conclusions, unverifiable sources, standard academic rejection language. But Howell, in a letter to a friend written shortly after the last rejection, described a different kind of response from one particular publisher, a larger one, a well-connected one. She wrote, "They didn't say the evidence was weak. The editor said very carefully, very politely, that some subjects are better left to rest. He said it twice. I counted." Let us talk about the hidden letter now. Howell reproduced only one line in her pamphlet, as we know, but the full letter, which Howell described in her private notes, though she never published those notes in full, tells a story that reframes everything. The letter was written by someone inside Aldenmore, someone literate, which narrows it considerably, someone who had access to the church and the nerve to document what they saw and the foresight to hide the documentation. Someone who was, almost certainly, one of the 6 people Thomas saw sitting quietly in the corner. The letter describes a program, not a survey, not a relocation, a program conducted by agents of a government body whose name Howell was never able to definitively identify, operating in rural communities across at least 3 counties during the 1830s and 40s. The program's purpose, as described in the letter, was the systematic collection of what the writer called vital and hereditary measures: height, weight, head circumference, visual acuity, strength assessments, indicators of disease resistance, family medical histories extracted through interviews conducted under the pretense of official census work, physical and cognitive assessments of children. The writer described these procedures with the careful, controlled language of someone trying very hard not to express the horror underneath the words. Every sentence is precise, clinical, as if writing with emotion would make the reality of what they were describing too large to contain on the page. And then, near the end, the control slips. The writer describes watching a child, a girl of perhaps 7, dark-haired, remarkable in her quickness, being measured and assessed with a thoroughness that went beyond anything a census required. Watching the men record their findings with evident satisfaction, watching them mark certain documents differently from others, and understanding finally what the marks meant. The marked individuals, the ones who scored highest on whatever criteria these men were applying, were not simply being recorded, they were being selected. Now, I need to give you context, because without it, what I am about to say sounds like conspiracy. With it, it sounds like history, which is far more disturbing. The word eugenics was not coined until 1883 by Francis Galton, Charles Darwin's cousin, but the ideas behind eugenics, the notion that human populations could and should be shaped through selective intervention, that certain hereditary traits were desirable and others were not, that the poor and the rural and the powerless were a laboratory as much as a community. Those ideas were circulating in British and European intellectual circles decades before Galton gave them a name. By the 1830s, there was already a network of gentlemen scientists, government-adjacent researchers, and influential aristocrats who believed, with the serene confidence of people who have never had to justify their beliefs to anyone, that the human population was a resource to be studied, catalogued, and quietly managed. They did not advertise this. They did not need to. They had access. They had funding from sources that left no public trail. They had relationships with government surveying bodies, with church administration, with the legal machinery that controlled rural communities. They had, in other words, everything they needed to conduct research on populations who had no way to refuse. Dr. Howell believed, and her private notes make this explicit even where her pamphlet is careful, that Aldenmore was not unique, that it was one of perhaps a dozen communities across Britain and the continent during the 1830s and 1840s, communities chosen for their isolation, their poverty,
their lack of political visibility. Communities chosen because nobody would notice, nobody would ask, nobody would come looking. And when the research was complete, when everything useful had been extracted, the community itself became a liability. Not because the people knew too much, most of them didn't, but because the place knew too much. Because a village on a map is a question that can be asked. A village that no longer exists on any map is a question that cannot be formed. This is why Aldenmore was not just cleared, it was unmade. Thomas finished his memoir in approximately 1889. He was in his early 60s. He had lived, by all evidence, a quiet life, a farmhand, then a smallholder, then an old man in a cottage 40 miles from a place whose name he had not spoken aloud in decades. He had married, had children, had, it seems, found something resembling peace in the ordinariness of a life lived carefully, without drawing attention, without asking questions that might bring men with long memories and longer arms back to his door. But he wrote the memoir. He left it where it could be found, not hidden like the letter, not destroyed, just placed, in an attic among ordinary things, in an envelope addressed to nobody. The last page of the memoir, the final legible passage before the water damage takes over and the words dissolve into blue-gray blur, reads like this: "I do not know what they wanted from us. I do not know if the men with the coats found what they were looking for in Aldenmore, or if we disappointed them, or if we were simply one stop among many on a road I was never allowed to see the full length of. I know only this: we were real. We were there. We had a church and a market square and a blacksmith and a river and children who played in the mud and people who loved each other in the imperfect and ordinary ways that people do. And someone decided that none of that was worth preserving. Not the place, not the name, not the memory. I am writing this because I am the memory now, and I am old, and I am afraid of what happens when I am gone." He was right to be afraid. Almost nobody read